Welcome back to In Response EDH. As always, I'm your host Albert, and I'm glad you can join us for another great Commander gameplay video. On today's episode, we have Devin making another appearance, and this time he brought with him Evelyn the Covetous. This deck is built to churn through his library and quickly fill his graveyard with goodies, to reanimate creatures or play spells directly from the graveyard. He starts the game off with Ledger Shredder, Vampire Nighthawk, Grim Hireling, Maestro's Theater, Shivan Reef, Watery Grave, and a swamp. Daniel is also back and has brought with him Aminatou the Fate Shifter. This deck uses his commander to flicker his permanents for extra ETB triggers and manipulates the top of his library for miracle shenanigans. He keeps an opening hand with Return to Dust, Primordial Mist, Scroll Rack, Shattered Sanctum, Barren Moor, Underground River, and a swamp. Also returning is Abel, and no surprise, he's brought another one of his Orzhov decks, this time led by Teysa Karlov. This is an aristocrat style deck, but also runs a handful of different combos. He starts off with a Butcher Ghoul, Mirror Moon Vessel, Blood Artist, Anointed Procession, Godless Shrine, Ash Barrens, and a swamp. And last but not least, I'm playing Gishath's Sun's Avatar. This is just your standard Dino tribal deck. I just want to ramp into Gishath and swing with huge creatures. I choose to start off with Rampant Growth, Ranging Raptors, Temple Altasaur, Zakama Primal Calamity, Burning Sun's Avatar, Jetmir's Garden, and an Ancient Tomb. Before we get started, we would like to remind you, if you enjoy our content and would like to support the channel, consider becoming a patron. When you do, you're not only contributing to the channel's growth, but you're also being entered in our monthly giveaways, as well as receiving patron-only perks. All proceeds of our Patreon are reinvested back into the channel to bring you the best content possible. We would also like to thank our sponsor, Dragon Shield. Hit the link in the description of this video to check out the best product out there to protect your cardboard. You can also support the channel by using our affiliate link when purchasing product and singles at TCG Player. With that said, and the introductions out of the way, let's start the game. Daniel starts us off playing a Shattered Sanctum untapped, mistaking it for a Vault of Champions. Don't worry, we catch it later. Devin then draws and plays a Maestro's Theater. He then cracks it and goes to find a mountain, putting it on the field tapped, and gains a life. I then start my turn by playing a tapped Jetmir's Garden and pass. Abel then shocks in a Godless Shrine, dealing himself 2 damage, and just passes the turn back to Daniel. Daniel then draws and plays an Underground River. He then taps both mana to cast a Scroll Rack. After that, he passes to Devin, who then draws and shocks in a Watery Grave, losing 2 life. He then taps out and casts a Ledger Shredder. I then follow that by playing a Forest and tapping 2 to cast a Rampant Growth. I then go to search for a land, and while I search, Abel land cycles his Ash Barrens to go search for a swamp and puts it into his hand. I then grab a Plains and drop it on the battlefield. Abel then starts his turn and plays a swamp he searched up. He then completes the cycle of turn 2 plays by casting a Blood Artist and then ends his turn. Daniel then draws and plays a Rupture Spire, tapping his Underground River to pay the cost to not sacrifice it. With no further plays, he passes. Devin then draws and plays a swamp. He then taps all his mana to cast an Ocean Rain, surveilling 2 cards into his graveyard and drawing 2 cards, as well as losing 2 life. He then moves to combat and swings his Ledger Shredder at Abel, dealing him 1 damage. I then start my turn and cast a Ranging Raptors. After that, I drop a Gruul Turf on the field, bouncing back the Plains to my hand. Abel then draws for turn and plays Urza's Saga as his land drop. He then taps his 3 mana to cast an Archaeomancer's Map. As it enters, he searches up 2 basic plains and puts them into his hand. Daniel then starts his turn by playing a swamp. Since he now controls more lands than Abel, Abel gets to put a land onto the battlefield. Devin then draws and plays a Dragon Skull Summit. He then moves to combat and swings at Abel again for another 1 damage and passes. I start my turn playing an Ancient Tomb. I then tap 3 to cast Rhythm of the Wild. I then take 2 damage from the tomb to cast Drover of the Mighty. This will trigger the Ledger Shredder, allowing Devin to connive. I then choose to put a +1/+1 counter on it from the Rhythm of the Wild. I then move to combat and swing my Raptors at Abel for 2 damage. With nothing else, I pass. Abel then draws and adds another lore counter to Urza's Saga. He then plays a Cave of Koilos as his land for turn, and follows that by playing an Anointed Procession. Before he ends his turn, Daniel cycles away his Baron Moor to draw a card. After that, he pays 1 to activate the scroll rack, drawing 3 cards and putting 3 cards he set aside back on top of his library. He then untaps and plays the basic plains as his land for turn. After that, he taps out to cast Primordial Mist. He then moves to his end step and manifests the top card of his library. Devin also has a play on his end step and casts a Fact or Fiction, choosing me to select the piles, but I hate doing it and pass the responsibility on to Abel. He then reveals a Spellseeker, City of Brass, Talisman of Indulgence, Dak Faden, and a Training Center. Abel then separates them into 2 piles, and Devin chooses the pile with more cards in it. He then starts his turn playing the Training Center we just saw. Devin then pays 4 mana to cast Grim Hireling. After that, he moves to combat and swings his flyer at Daniel. And this allows him to make 2 treasures with the Grim Hireling. Devin then spends the treasures to help cast Dak Faden. He uses Dak's second ability to steal Daniel's scroll rack. With nothing else, he passes. I draw and replay the plains. I then completely tap out to cast my commander, Gishath, Sun's Avatar. As it enters, I choose to give him a +1/+1 counter with the Rhythm of the Wild. I then go to combat and swing at Abel.
I'll take it all.
Get your dinos. Sounds like there's a damnation. He takes 8 damage. Gishath then triggers, and I flip the top 8 cards of my library, and get to put all dinosaurs revealed this way onto the battlefield. Those being Ghalta, Primal Hunger, Quartzwood Crasher, and Zatopa, Primal Dawn. When they enter, I put a +1/+1 counter on each of them. Abel then starts his turn, activating the Urza's Saga to make a construct, but instead makes 2 thanks to the Anointed Procession. He then draws for turn, and he sacrifices the Urza's Saga to search up a Skull Clamp. He then plays another Plains, and follows that up by casting a Butcher Ghoul. He then pays 1 to equip one of the constructs with the Skull Clamp, and with nothing else, he passes the turn. Devin then remembers about his Ledger Shredder trigger, and we allow him to connive. Daniel draws for turn, and he casts his commander, Aminatou, the Fate Shifter. Daniel uses her minus ability to flicker the manifest token and return it to the battlefield face up, revealing a Demon Lord Belzenlock. As it enters, he exiles the top of his library until he reveals a non-land card. He finds a Mistbind Click and puts it into his hand and loses a life. He then repeats the process since it was CMC 4 or greater, and then reveals a Vendilion Click, again putting it into his hand and losing a life. Daniel then pays 1 life to tap the Underground River for blue mana, and then casts a Baleful Strix. As it enters, he draws a card. This is Daniel's second spell, which triggers Devin's Ledger Shredder, so he draws and discards a card. He then moves to his end step and manifests the top card with the Primordial Mist. Devin then starts his turn and plays a City of Brass. He then taps 4 mana and plays a Sorcery Speed Notion Thief, but does it for a good reason. He activates Dak Faden's +1 ability.
Because I like looking death in the face, I'm going to target you, Albert, so you get to draw 2 cards and then discard 2 cards. However, I'm going to draw 2 cards and you're going to discard 2 cards.
Okay, you're getting hit with everything.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Polyraptor and Burning Sun's Avatar.
See, the secret is if you kill me, I can go home.
Devin then activates the Scroll Rack, exchanging the top 4 cards of his library with 4 cards from his hand. After that, he taps the City of Brass, dealing 1 damage to himself, to cast Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. This triggers the Ledger Shredder, and he connives, discarding a creature card. This puts a +1/+1 counter on the bird, and after that he goes to combat and swings at ʔᴏ for 2 more damage. ʔᴏ then remembers the Archaeomancer's map trigger and plays a swamp. I then start my turn by casting a Temple Altasaur and choose to give it haste and go to combat. I swing Ghalta at ʔᴏ, which he blocks with 3 creatures, Zetalpa at Daniel, and Gishath, Quartzwood Crasher, and the Temple Altasaur at Devin. Daniel blocks with his Belzenlock and takes 4 trample damage. Devin then blocks the Temple Altasaur with his Grim Hireling. Since 5 creatures died, ʔᴏ targets me with all the Blood Artist triggers and drains me for 5 life. Gishath then triggers and I flip the top 8 cards of my library, this time only finding a Death Gorge Scavenger. When it enters, I put a +1/+1 counter on it and exile the Demon Lord in Daniel's graveyard, and eventually gain 2 life. The Quartzwood Crasher then triggers, and I apparently don't know how my own card works, and make 1 really big dinosaur instead of 1 relatively smaller dinosaur for each opponent that was dealt trample damage.
It's that late night magic brain.
One good thing about missing some of your dinosaurs off the triggers, you don't get so blown out when they
board wipe
you the next turn.
Fair. Oh, but you have no cards in hand, right?
Yeah.
Oh, you do? Okay, cool. So I can still try to attack Evelyn.
Why would you do that?
Oh, it's funny now.
Okay.
I'm dying anyway, it doesn't matter.
We were taking him out.
Yeah, but now you're taking everybody out. Also, me making you discard cards has nothing to do with killing you. Yeah, I'd like to point out, you attacked ʔᴏ with 1 dinosaur, me with 3 dinosaurs.
But it was a lot of dinosaur. It was a lot of dinosaur.
I got the most dinosaur, though.
You did, but you made me discard 2 cards.
Oh no, a mind bot. Oh god.
Alright, I'll cast Phyrexian on life.
Holy smokes.
See, should have just swung at him with everything.
He then follows that up by casting a Sensei's Divining Top. ʔᴏ then immediately pays 1 to activate it and looks at the top 3 cards of his library and rearranges them. After that, he ends his turn. Daniel draws for turn, and Devin finally remembers to connive with the Ledger Shredder. Daniel then moves to combat and swings at Dak Vaden with his Baleful Strix, knocking it down to 1 loyalty. He then floats 4 mana and uses the Primordial Mist to exile a manifest token, revealing a Lotus Field, which he then plays, and sacrifices 2 lands as it enters. He then uses his floating mana to cast Damnation. 14 creatures die, and ʔᴏ targets me with all the Blood Artist triggers, draining me for 14. Daniel then uses Aminatou's second ability to exile his Scroll Rack to return it to his side of the battlefield. He then moves to his end step and manifests the top card of his library and passes. Devin then starts his turn by playing a Morphic Pool. After that, he activates Dak Vaden again, choosing himself to draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. He then taps out and casts Nicol Bolas, God Pharaoh. He chooses to use his first ability and targets me with it. I then exile cards from the top of my library till I hit a non-land card, which is a Majestic Heliopterus. Devin then plays it without paying its mana cost and passes. I then draw for turn and tap out, losing 2 from the Ancient Tomb. To cast a Goring Ceratops.
Joke's on you, Zetalpa already has Double Strike.
As it enters, I choose to give it haste and go to combat, swinging both my creatures at Nicol Bolas. This is more than enough to take it out, and before I end my turn, ʔᴏ activates Sensei's Divining Top and put the top back on top of his library. He then casts a Vampiric Tutor, losing 2 life, and goes searching for a card to put back on top of his library. He then starts his turn and draws that card. ʔᴏ then casts the Smothering Tithe he searched for.
Did we just cast Smothering Tithe? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I forgot that I actually have fucking interaction in this deck. So I have to kind of pay attention. I'm gonna pay 1 and Swan Song the Smothering Tithe.
Alright.
You get a 2/2 bird. I'll have birds.
ʔᴏ follows that up by casting a Mirror Moon Vessel. He then equips it with the Skull Clamp, which kills it off, adding 1 colorless mana to his mana pool and drawing 2 cards. ʔᴏ then finds a Flooded Strand to play. He then cracks it, losing a life, to search up a scrubland to the field. He then pays 2 to cast a Reassembling Skeleton. With nothing else, he passes the turn. Daniel begins turn 8, playing a Plains, and tapping out to cast Magister Sphinx. As it enters, he chooses to have ʔᴏ's life total become 10. He then removes the last loyalty from Aminatou to flicker the Sphinx and make Devin's life total also become 10. He then moves to his end step and manifests the top card of his library. Devin then draws for turn and plays a Drowned Catacomb. He then uses ʟᴑᴏᴜᴜ to draw 2 cards and discard 2.
Gishath had a hard time.
I'm gonna cast Persist, targeting Evil Twin. I'm gonna have Evil Twin enter as
Do it.
copy
Do it.
of the Sphinx. I'm gonna make your life total become 10.
I'm not even mad. I'm not even mad. Wow.
Yes. He follows that up by casting a Vampire Nighthawk and ends his turn. I draw for turn and play a Command Beacon. I then tap 6 to cast a ᴑɪᴜᴜᴜᴜ, choosing to give it haste with the Rhythm of the Wild. After that, I go to combat and swing all my creatures at Abel. He throws the bird in front of ᴬᴜᴜ and the skeleton in front of the Ceratops, but still takes enough damage to knock him down to 0, but still lives thanks to the Phyrexian Rebirth. Abel then starts his turn and decides to return the reassembling skeleton from his graveyard to the battlefield tapped. He then pays to equip it with the Skull Clamp to kill it off and draw 2 cards. He then plays the Cabal Coffers as his land for turn and activates the Cabal Coffers for 4 black mana, using 3 of it to cast Phyrexian Altar. After that, he casts a Gleaming Barrier and pays to equip the Skull Clamp to it. After that, he sacrifices it to the altar, creating 2 treasures when the creature dies and drawing 2 cards. He then finds and recasts Sensei's Divining Top and just ends his turn. Daniel draws a card and drops a tapped Arcane Sanctum on the battlefield. He then taps 4 mana to cast Return to Dust to exile the Phyrexian Unlife and the Rhythm of the Wild. With the Phyrexian Unlife off the field and his life total at 0, Abel gets knocked out of the game. On Daniel's end step, Devin casts Dahada's Ploy, drawing 2 cards, discarding 1 card, and gaining 1 life. He then starts his turn and draws. Devin then casts an Animate Dead. Heliopterus? Okay.
Yep, Heliopterus is the words that came out of my face.
He chooses to reanimate the Ghalta in my graveyard and then activates ʟᴑᴜᴜ's second ability to steal Daniel's Magister Sphinx. In response, Daniel exiles 1 of his tokens and reveals and casts a Crib Swap. But in response to this, Devin casts Counter Squall to counter it, and Daniel loses 2 life. Devin then takes control of the Sphinx and he passes. I draw and quickly tap out, losing 2 life to cast Zacama, Primal Calamity. When it enters, I untap all my lands. I then use Zacama to deal 3 damage to the Nighthawk Scavenger, as well as the ability to destroy target artifact, choosing the copy of the Sphinx. Devin already knows what's coming next and chooses to cast Maestro's Charm on his way out to deal 5 damage to my Goring Ceratops. I then move to combat and swing my ᴑɪᴜᴜᴜᴜ at Daniel and ᴬᴜᴜ at Devin, knocking him out of the game. After that, I end my turn. Daniel then starts his turn, and on his upkeep, I tap 3 to use Zacama to destroy his Scroll Rack, and dealing 2 damage to myself from the Ancient Tomb. He then draws and taps the Lotus Field for blue mana to cast Vendilion Click, targeting himself. He then reveals the Enchanted Evening and puts it on the bottom of his library. He then draws a card. After that, he moves to his end step and manifests the top card of his library again. On my upkeep, Daniel exiles a face-down card and reveals it and plays a Mistbind Click, championing the Vendilion Click to tap all my lands down. In response, I float all my mana and lose 2 from the Ancient Tomb. I then use that mana to activate Zacama to destroy 2 manifests and his Magister Sphinx. After that, I move straight to combat and swing all my creatures in Dan's direction. This is more than enough to kill him, and he scoops it up.
Alright, you got me.
Alright.
Woo, Albert won again.
Yeah!
That never happens.
I know. Well, that's another win for me and Gishath. This is my daughter's deck, but man is it fun to play. I love playing free spells and big creatures, and this deck does both of those things. Even though Daniel's Damnation completely wrecked me for a bit, ᴬᴜᴜ was able to keep me in the game, and for that, it's today's MVP. Devin's deck was doing what it's meant to do, which is draw and discard cards. Only he didn't find too many ways to make use of all the cards he filled his graveyard with. But making a copy of the Sphinx and resetting Daniel's life total to 10 was a pretty cool play. Even though I was the one attacking, Daniel's deck seemed to do the most damage by putting everyone else's life total to 10. This actually put him in a good position to win if only he was able to find some of the many spells in his deck that drain us for life. Abel drew quite a bit of hate early in the game, since we knew he was the combo deck at the table, but playing Phyrexian Unlife didn't help him out at all, and just ended up putting more of a target on his back. Once I knocked him down to 0, Daniel had the perfect answer to kill him with the Return to Dust. Well, that's it for this episode. If you enjoyed this game, consider stopping by our Twitch streams for Salty Tier Tuesdays every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and Fridays at 7 Pacific Standard Time for live Commander action. Make sure to like the video and leave a comment, and if you aren't already subscribed, hit the subscribe button. Before we go, we'd like to give a big thank you to our amazing patrons. We are glad to have your support and thankful for each and every one of you. We here at In Response would like to thank you for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and make sure you follow us on our social medias. We also stream every Friday night at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Thank you for watching. Have an awesome day.